Today's guest is Professor Robin Hanson, who is a professor of economics at George Mason University, a futurist, and author of several books, including the book The Age of M, as well as the co-author of The Elephant in the Brain. And we're right on cue here, so it seems like we're in sick, Robin. I kind of discovered you from a 2023 article that you wrote, which was entitled A Fertility Reckoning. What is the Fertility Reckoning?
Well, as you may know, fertility is declining and has been declining pretty rapidly, pretty globally for a while now. And that's a problem. That is, first of all, it means that if it just continues, which it seems likely, population will peak and then decline. And then as a result, innovations rates will decline with the size of the economy as it declines. And then innovation is sort of the main thing driving, say, liberality and free speech and democracy and things like that. So those may well decline too, and we will just have a declining civilization like the Roman Empire, which then gets replaced by other civilizations, cultures that may just differ a lot from ours and reject a lot of what we hold dear. So that's the basic prospect. But it's worse than that. It's a sign of an underlying problem. So if you think about biology, it's just a crazy bad sign for a species in times of plenty to be declining. That's saying something has gone seriously wrong with the evolutionary process that would usually make fertility high when times of plenty and lots of resources and opportunities.
If you were to ask the average person, tell them like, hey, we have people having less children, populations declining. I mean, global fertility is like 2.2, replacement's 2.1, but that number is deceptive because in some countries, the replacement rate is actually closer to 3, depending on your medical care and mortality, infant mortality, etc. And you're a professor at a university. So do your students, do they think this is kind of like a joke that we're concerned about a shrinking population? Like, it seems most people, even in 2025, aren't too concerned about a lowering of the population and a lowering of fertility.
I agree that most people don't seem very concerned, including my students. I think if an outside force were imposing it on us, we might well feel afraid and outraged by that. Or if it was even being imposed by nature, say some disease was running through us, making it hard to reproduce, or perhaps even imposed by elites that we were suspicious of and could resent. Any of those sorts of sources of something like this could well trigger resentment and opposition and an intention to defy. That may well be, for example, why Israel has the unusually high fertility, because they've got so many people trying to push them down and so much local opposition that they want to defy. But this comes from within our culture. So I've been a sort of STEM person most of my life. I did physics long ago, computer science, and then economics for a long time. And as a STEM person, I didn't think much of culture, I have to say. That is, it was this fuzzy thing that, museums and songs and, people who write, speeches or whatever. And that didn't seem the important things to me. The important things were solid, jobs and making stuff and machines and, the basic infrastructure of our lives. And when people even think about culture, they are mostly, even if they think about it as the thing they love. That is what their parents and everyone has taught them are the good things. And their culture is really the good things we value. And we trust our culture. That is, if we've been taught that democracy is great or free speech is great or whatever it is, then hey, it's great. And we feel that strongly. And if culture's changed recently to, say, have more rights for women or minorities or, sexual preferences or whatever, we think that's just great because we were taught it's great and it feels great. So we're not very inclined to sort of look at things that come from culture as plausibly bad, as problematic. That is, culture is the thing that tells us which other things in the world are good, and then we go try to use that sign to go push for other things. So if culture tells us global warming is bad, then we're going to go fight global warming Culture tells us racism is bad. We're going to go fight racism. But if culture tells us we should have fewer kids, then we go, why not have fewer kids? What's wrong with that? Like, we're enjoying ourselves. There's less environmental destruction. It's really hard to sort of step back from your culture and wonder if the thing you love, deeply feel emotionally precious to you, could be telling you wrong.
So, Professor Hanson, let's just get back to this article where you mentioned, the article, of course, is titled A Fertility Reckoning. And you mentioned there's like, I don't know, maybe 6, 7 key points that you make about why we're having a decrease in fertility. You mentioned basically in this article that there's value birth control, city life, schooling, intensive parenting, finding ourselves, in quotes, before marriage, and then we prefer careers to basically friends and family. So what are kind of the main, your main thesis of this in terms of these effects on culture and having a shrinking fertility rate?
So if you look at fertility decline and you ask, what's caused that? Why is that happening? I think you'll find as the most proximate causes some key cultural trends in society over the last century or so, and some of them for shorter time. And so if you look most specifically, you'll see, say, increasing amounts of education. You'll see, a switch from marriage norms, from marrying early as a cornerstone of life versus marrying later as a capstone of life. You'll see trends of gender equality, certainly, trends of having your grandparents less involved in children and raising them and, supporting them and controlling them, or even arranging marriages. You'll see increasing urbanity, decreasing religion. And these trends, most of them have been going along for a relatively long time. And so, and most of them we kind of like. That is, we emotionally feel like these are good trends, right? These are, it's good to pay more attention to children. It's like one of the trends is we just pay a lot more attention to children than we did a long time ago. We feel like we should be around them, directing them, watching them. And, if you watch an old movie in, say, the 30s or 40s and see parents interacting with children, what you see is the parents are mostly ignoring the children. And the children don't mind that. They're doing stuff. If the kids need food or something, or you need protection, they'll do it, but they're not really paying that much attention. But now we have really high norms for how much attention parents should be paying to kids. They should be driving them around, managing things a lot. And we feel that's right. That is, if we see a neighbor whose parents are not paying much attention to children, we think that's bad, that they're mistreating their children. We see someone who, doesn't help their children get as much education as possible. We think they're mistreating their children there as well, right? If we see somebody who marries early, we say that's bad. You should have waited until you knew yourself better and were more mature and had yourself more set. So most of these trends are trends that we emotionally feel are good trends, that they are the right way to treat people and treat ourselves. But they add up to falling fertility, which then most people think, well, that can't be too much of a problem. I mean, there's 8 billion people. Surely we have a lot of people in the world. How could we, if we had 4 or even 2, or even 1, that would still be plenty of people, they might think, right? So I think, again, the proximate causes of fertility decline are a number of social trends that are long-term cultural trends that most of us like. And but if we want to stand back and we actually think fertility is a problem, we want to say, well, okay, what's causing all these cultural trends? Why are there so many cultural trends going in the same direction, cutting fertility?
I've seen you in a lot of podcasts, and you're talking about, like, it seems like a lot of people, they look at just the benefits of a falling fertility, smaller population. But then in one of the podcasts, you're talking about flights. Okay, like, the population shrinks, and so now all of a sudden, instead of having flights 7 days a week to some city you want to go to, well, maybe you're going to have a flight twice a week to some city where people are generally thinking like, oh, housing is going to be cheap. We can, go to a national park or something and there's going to be no one else there or whatever. But then it's like, okay, well, what about all like the old people that are, as civilization gets older, isn't like the majority of the workforce is going to be taking care of old people, and maybe all this time off that you think you're going to have, you're not going to have, and who's going to maintain like all the sewage systems and the plumbing and the electrical running to cities where no one lives anymore. Look at the example of Detroit. I mean, Detroit is like what it would really look like. It's not going to look like Japan. I mean, Japan is kind of an exception because they were able to offshore all their manufacturing and all their labor. So they kind of were able to use other people's surplus, other countries' surplus population to kind of augment their situation. What do you think of that, Robin?
I think there are many sort of practical implications of falling fertility that we could walk through. But I fear that modest practical inconveniences just really can't weigh much against strong cultural, value feelings. If basically people are having fewer kids because of value changes and norm changes that they feel strongly about. And so pointing out practical consequences is not really going to go that far to move them. We've seen previous, civilizations in history that had population declines due to fertility declines, and their leaders were concerned and tried to reverse it and pretty much couldn't do that much because people said, no, we like this. So that's more the worry. I think you'll have to point to something as grand and big in people's minds as the values they feel they are achieving through their new lower fertility if you're going to move them on this. To see that there's even an issue that they should be worried about. Now, as an economist, I could try to appeal to your economic sense. I could try to say, look, paying for having kids is actually a win-win deal if you think about it. That is, if children enjoy their lives more than the cost of creating them, we should find a way to do that, to make that deal happen. And in fact, there are ways to make that deal happen such that fertility is a win-win deal. But so far in history, we've treated fertility as a gift. Parents give the gift of life to the children, and that's worked to produce more life. But if in fact parents are saying, maybe that's not worth it so much to me anymore, we can instead make this a deal, a transaction where both sides get what they want. But we would have to change our institutions a bit to accommodate that, to be able to represent and implement such deals. But if you aren't willing to think about the benefit and the value for society in general of having more fertility, then maybe we can turn people's attention to win-win deals that we could make that would increase fertility.
Right, because if you're talking like culturally, like people aren't going to give up the cushy life we have now to sacrifice to have more kids, and then the time that the repercussions are kind of unfolding is just already too late, right? We're already kind of down like the path of no return. Are we at that point of no return as well right now?
There's never a point of no return, but what will happen is in the transition period where we notice a problem might be the easiest time to get people motivated to do something about it. Once you're used to a problem and it's just been the problem everybody's dealt with, then you might not be as motivated to deal with. You might think, why should I deal with it any better than the last two generations who didn't deal with it? Why, let the next generation deal with it or something, right? But eventually, what will happen is that some subgroup in the world will find a way to have high fertility and insulate themselves from the rest of the world culture, and then they will grow, and then eventually they will just come to dominate. So that's, in some sense, the deadline here. And then the game is over. That is, we lost, our civilization declined, and something else replaced us. So then I guess the question is, when might you be able to point to that and motivate people by saying, look, you're about to be replaced. Do you care? So those are the two times you might motivate people to act is one, when you first see this long-term arc of decline, because we didn't really see it, say, a generation or two ago. Now we see it, the first time to see it, and can we motivate people now? And then the next time might be when we're about to be replaced, but that's like kind of late in the process. it might just be too late at that point to do that much, because these are hard things to do. Turning your whole life culture. So I like to give the analogy, say you're on a ship heading for an iceberg. There's two basic strategies to deal with this problem. One is to turn the whole ship, to coordinate with the other passengers and staff of the ship to actually turn the whole damn ship. And that's hard because you have to, have a lot of coordination to do, and it's a big ship, and you'll have a lot of sacrifices of like going one way versus another. The other solution is to get on lifeboats. Find small boats that can detach from the big boat and just give up on the big boat. And that's, in a sense, what these small insular fertile subcultures like the Amish or Haredim are doing. They are detaching from our main world civilization and doubling every 20 years. And that's how the Christians took over the Roman Empire. They just doubled every 20 years for 3 centuries. And that did it. And the Romans knew they were in decline, and they knew they had a problem, but they really couldn't fix it.
Speaking of culture, I think when you say culture, most people think like, oh, you're talking like fine wine, or you're talking like art or literature. Right. But it's also like the big part of culture is like, religion, or how many kids we're going to have, the family values. Those are like the big kind of cultural values, but people don't really think of that. And then also like the whole world is kind of, what's the global fertility rate now? Like, right around 2.2, and the whole world is basically homogenous. I find it interesting. Like, I lived abroad for 5 years, and it's like when you go to some other country, it's basically like living in the US. There are, obviously differences, but it's, if you would have traveled in say like 1930 and went to a different country, it probably almost would have been like going to another planet, at least, when you read a book. Right. Now it's like you'd be in like Bali, and you're like cruising down the strip, and it's like a KFC and a McDonald's, and right. It's like, am I in Florida West or something, like, so can you kind of explain, like, and we keep talking about cultural drift.
Right. So let's say what culture means and then talk about how varieties declined enormously. So there's broad and narrow definitions of concepts, and they're related. So the broadest definition of culture is just everything humans do. So humanity's superpower is the fact that we can change our behavior by copying the behavior of other people. Other animals really can't do that much. And that's why they're so stuck in their patterns of behavior for such a long time. They change only very slowly because most of their change is driven by their DNA changing. We have been able to change our behavior much faster because we can copy each other. So pretty much everything we do that we can learn by copying other people, that's culture in the broadest sense of the word. But there's 2 levels of culture. There's the kind of culture that you can vary individually. So if you see somebody with a fishing technique and you just copy their fishing technique, and now you fish like they fish, that's a thing that you can vary personally, individually. And then we have a lot of variety of that. The whole world is full of the ability of people to change how they do little things, how they drive their car, how they mow their grass, how they make their bed, right? And but then there's this other level of culture, which is the things that we share where it's hard to deviate, like, say, the value of going to school or a capstone marriage. Like, when a culture puts a lot of value of people going to school, if you deviate, you suffer. That is, you go to school less, but now people think less of you. And so you can't really deviate in the sense of changing the culture. So the things that cultures share in terms of norms and values, those don't vary as much around the world. You have to sort of go to a different culture that has a different value for those things if you're going to have variations of those things. And when people use the word culture, they often mean museums and music and art and things like that. And the reason why the word culture is especially appropriate for those, because that's where we actually find out a lot of our values and norms. That is, songs and TV shows, etc. They tell us what other people's values and norms are, and that's how we often learn what they are. And when those things change, people change their beliefs about what values and norms are, because that's the main channel of communication where they learn those things. Okay, so that's the sort of different definitions of culture. Culture is just everything we do, but except there's the shared parts of culture that are harder to change. And then there's the high culture, which is often the main medium by which we learn those things. Now, 3 centuries ago, the world had hundreds of thousands of peasant cultures, each of 1,000 or 2 peasants, and mostly independent of each other, mostly self-sufficient, making their own clothes and food and everything else. And they had enormous variety in these cultures, enormous attitudes toward marriage, attitudes toward gender, attitudes toward work and religion and the nation and, all sorts of other things. And then in the last few centuries, we have vastly reduced that variety. So that's what you're referring to. A few centuries ago, if you went from like village to village around the world, you would just see enormously different attitudes, behaviors, and all sorts of things. Even a century ago, you would see around the world enormously different attitudes and behaviors around a lot of different things. But basically, we did this in two steps. One is we crushed peasant cultures into nation states. So the famous book called Peasants and the Frenchmen about how this happened in France, but it happened everywhere in the world. We made little local peasant cultures the same by making them speak a national language, having national schools, national standards, national dress, etc. And that crushed a lot of variety. So we got from hundreds of thousands of peasants cultures to, 100 or so national cultures. And then in the last century, elites in these cultures have mingled at elite institutions, elite universities and NGOs and elite media to merge into an elite world culture that if you go around the world, you see them all the same. So whenever I meet elites around the world, I hear the following two messages. The first is, the place I come from, those people have distinct features that the world should value. We're more passionate, we're more thoughtful, whatever it is, right? They want to defend the place they come from as having unique value the world should recognize. That's what elites around the world say. But then the next thing they say is, me personally, I will fit in anywhere just fine. I don't have any distinctive features that reflect my origin of culture that would prevent me from working at any international finance firm or NGO or business group or charity or whatever it is. So they themselves are presenting themselves as fully integrated into a world elite culture, having went to the right schools and talking to the right people, and they are just a uniform world elite. And so people vary more at lower levels of status, but at the highest levels, they're really quite uniform. And that's produced an enormous convergence around the world, not just in music but in values. So many people like the idea that we're in a multicultural world, and they want to be in a multicultural. What they mean by that is a world where you have maybe a variety of foods and clothes and holidays and myths, and maybe ways you decorate your home. But if you ask what about variety in attitudes toward gender or war or democracy? Well, they hate that. They do not want variety in those things. So by multiculturalism, they want a pretty shallow variety in surface features of behavior, but deep values and norms, they really want the whole world to share those. So for example, you saw that in COVID. Once the COVID showed up, people talked around the world about what to do, and then the whole world did it pretty much the same. And any substantial parts of the world that were seen as deviating were seen as an offense and a need of repression and need of teaching that they should do it the same as everybody else, because the whole world knew the right way to do things, and anybody who disagreed was wrong and needed to turn around and join the world. And that's how it is for lots of value things around the world. If you look at regulation of airlines or banks or nuclear power or medical experiments, etc., you just see enormous convergence around the world.
The article that I mentioned, you talked about the fertility reckoning. You basically say that innovation will kind of come to a halt. And then I was researching innovation and population, and I was reading a article that was saying, or a academic paper that was saying that the rate of innovation peaked in 1873 and is now rapidly declining. We're somewhere like around 95% of the way to the end of innovation, and that the number of patents per capita peaked in 1916, well before World War II. How does population decline and innovation, what's the correlation between the two? And do you think we're past peak innovation?
Okay, so there are a number of different issues here, but let's start with the most basic one. The most basic idea in our literature on innovation is that innovation is proportional to activity. So the more people are doing more stuff, just as a side effect of doing stuff, there's innovation. And that means as the economy gets larger, there's more innovation. And that's an effect of just growth. Now, there's also a diminishing returns effect where we grab the most attractive, easiest innovations first. And then later on, we're having to scrape the bottom of the barrel for less attractive, less promising ones that are more trouble. So these are two contrary effects about innovation over time. And the overall pattern, at least over short periods, is that these two roughly balance. That is, as the population grows and the economy grows, we have more innovation because there's just more activity, but it's less valuable because we got diminishing returns. And apparently, typically, these two roughly balance. So we have roughly steady rates of growth over the long run. Now, that's the first cut thing to say. The second cut thing to say is there have been these huge changes in the innovation rate in history. Say the Industrial Revolution was an enormous change. We went from the economy doubling roughly every 1,000 years to roughly every 15 years in a short period. And then the farming revolution, say 5 or 10,000 years ago, was another change where we went from doubling the world economy roughly every 250,000 years to every 1,000 years. So there clearly are enormous potential perhaps for vastly increasing the rate of innovation if we sort of find a new mode. But the last time that happened was the Industrial Revolution a while ago. So since then, we've been growing. Now, in this period, if you look at just the biggest, most juicy innovations, you may well see a decline in those because of this diminishing returns effect. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were just going into this huge space of all this juicy, cool stuff, and we grabbed the easiest stuff first. And so you will see the biggest ideas that had the biggest change happened early on, and then later on we were moving to the smaller ideas, the more things that were more work. But the net effect has been relatively steady growth because the economy's been growing pretty much exponentially for a century, say. But that does require that the population at least not shrink. We have a lot of economic theory that I trust that says if the population shrinks, then activity shrinks. And now innovation shrinks proportional to activity. But now the diminishing return effect doesn't go away. So we would no longer have the increasing activity because of growth, but we would still have the diminishing returns effect because we did the good stuff first. And so the straightforward prediction, which I believe, is that innovation rates will just decline. And for example, we've already seen that in Japan. Japan has already reached a peak and started to decline in its population, and it's had falling innovation, especially since innovation tends to happen more for young people, and you have fewer young people. And so we've just seen substantially falling rates of patenting and other rates of innovation in Japan. But you should expect that to happen to the world as world population peaks and then decline. I mean, it's actually even worse because when world population peaks, say African population will still be rising while the rest of the world's population will still be declining. And this is a key question: can Africans keep up per capita at innovation rates to substitute for the rest of the world's decline? That's an open question. I mean, there must be, of course, there is some reason they're late. And if that reason is correlated with their capacity for innovation, then in fact, innovation will peak before population peaks. And it'll already be declining then.
I saw you on a podcast where someone asked you in the crowd, basically like, we have less people being born, fertility rates decreasing, but we can increase the intelligence of people maybe with new technologies like gene editing, et cetera, whatever, so then we can create more Silicon Valleys. And then your kind of answer was like, just because you're smart doesn't mean you're actually creating inventions. You're not, like there's a lot of other things that maybe we don't know, but there's a lot of other cultural inputs that allow people to invent things. Every country in the world has basically tried to create their own version of Silicon Valley, and they all kind of have failed. And then in the article that I was mentioning, he kind of mentions how since the peak invention was 1873, obviously since then we've put so much money into higher education, or quote unquote higher education. We put so much money into educating people, educating women, etc. Yet every year we're getting less inventions. So it doesn't necessarily seem like just because you're smart, like, or just because you're educated, doesn't necessarily mean we're actually inventing anything. So is there any correlation between, like, hey, we'll just like educate ourselves out of this problem? It seems like that is like a kind of a pie in the sky theory.
Right. So as you mentioned, for a long time, the world noticed that the innovative nations were winning. They were getting rich and winning militarily and dominating the world. And everybody else said, we want to be like those. And so they've all said, how can we be like those more rich, winning, innovative nations? And they've tried to copy surface features in order to do that. And they mostly failed. That is, it's actually really hard to say, make your own Silicon Valley or make your own venture capital industry or whatever it is. There's just a lot of details that matter that are hard to see and hard to control, unfortunately. And so even places like the United States, we might say we want to be more innovative, but we don't actually manage to do it. Now, part of that's because we're not really serious. It basically various people who want various benefits like the education industry, they claim to be the source of innovation and we hand money to them on the basis of that claim, but it's not true. They're just claiming credit. And so it might be that if we worked harder, we could do better. But there's a whole literature in economics about innovation and mechanisms for promoting it and data on what correlates with it. And the basic answer is we just find it pretty hard to promote innovation. That's just the basic fact. We don't know how to do it very well. And so it's not that there aren't substantial differences and maybe eventually you could figure them out, but people have been trying this for a while. Being the next Silicon Valley, the next source of, innovation, et cetera, and not actually doing that. Even China, remarkably, has been growing like gangbusters, but it's less due to innovation than just pure capital growth. If you look at productivity gains in China, they are less impressive than just the pure growth of making lots of stuff. So, it's possible that we will make high IQ people, but honestly, that looks like a long shot, right? The world's not that eager to do genetic engineering to create high IQ people. Yes, if we could, they would help, but I just don't see a revolution in that happening soon. There's just too many cultural obstacles to that.
We all heard years ago that China was going to kind of take over the world. They had years ago, the second highest GDP. And now all of a sudden, the whole one child policy is really kind of taken effect. And now they have like this major imbalance between men and women. I've read that for like kind of like men and women in child kind of bearing years, that there's a massive difference between the number of women, because of course during the one child policy a lot of the women were killed. So now all of a sudden you have all these like angry young men of youth that can't have wives because there's just not enough women to accommodate them. Do you think China just is going to implode? I mean, culturally it seems like that's just not sustainable to have this massive imbalance between men and women of childbearing age.
So a place like China, you might hope elites there would have a better ability to sort of see long-term problems and have the power to do something, right? So you might think like Europe or the US, we're too in control. The public is too much in control. We're just going to go on our vibes. And even if elites can see a problem, they can't really make us do anything about it. But China, they've got an authoritarian government with, strong control of elites and lots of talking among elites. And surely they've seen this problem. Like they have noticed this is a problem, right? But they aren't really able to do much about it. That's a striking fact, that China knows it has a serious fertility problem. That's clearly the biggest threat to its cultural and economic dominance over the next half century and century is its declining fertility. And yet they have just not made much of a dent at all into it. That's a striking fact. So let's make an analogy with corporate cultures. So most corporations have cultures that matter a lot for whether they do well or badly. And if you look at, say, the top firm like the S&P 500, they only stay on that list for 20 years or less. And the reason is they decay and go down. So and on that list, 90% of the value of firms is not assignable to particular capital and identifiable things you could count up about that firm, it's basically culture. So culture forms the most of the value of corporations. And most corporations, their culture doesn't last very long. It decays, and that's why they decline. And CEOs know this fact about their company. They know they've got this huge stake in the company and they want to promote it. And they know most of whether the company goes up or down will be based on culture. And so they have this enormous incentive and power. CEOs control companies in a way much more than even the Chinese government controls China or the US government controls the US, right? And so they have power and incentive and the knowledge that culture is the problem and they want to fix it. And even so, culture decays. That is, say, corporations typically have cultural change initiatives where they're trying to say, we want our culture to go this way, and they put a lot of money into it, and they have the power to order people to do things, and they know their whole wealth depends on this, and yet 2/3 of the time, these change initiatives are said to fail. Even CEOs can't actually make their companies go in the cultural directions they want, typically. And that's why companies fail, and the CEOs know that, and they have all this money at stake, and they can't stop it. That's for companies. So if even CEOs of companies can't control their culture drifting and decaying into failure, why think the Chinese government could do better? They clearly can't. They are failing. And therefore, elites around the world are also unable to turn their cultures in the direction they might prefer, even if they were trying, but they're not really trying much.
So speaking of these corporations that can't control the culture, what are the biggest cultural killers of these corporations that these CEOs know, as you're saying, but they can't necessarily control or get under wraps?
Well, I mean, there's a standard long list of things that go wrong with companies. One of them is that they allow silos to be created, organizations that sort of put up walls and don't let anybody see inside and don't let outsiders have much influence over to protect their part of the company from the rest. And then they don't necessarily, innovate or develop what the company might need. They just protect their silo. Companies accumulate rules and procedures excessively. Companies get in the habit of too many meetings, too many interviews for new people, too many definitions of roles and things like that. And then, of course, often a company has just a norm of certain go-getters were famous at the beginning for their exemplary performance, and they inspired other people to be like them, and that people had a certain habit of doing certain things because their exemplar leaders had done those before, and that has sort of set the example for people to copy. And then the next generation isn't like that. They're not go-getters, and they're not exemplary, and they're just sort of bureaucrats running their way up, and now everybody sees that, so they copy that. And now the whole company isn't very go-getter and isn't trying to do, big things like the first guys were. You just lost that generation and lost them as an example, right? So these are just a small number of examples of so many things that go wrong with culture, but it shows you that the same thing can happen with our larger macro cultures too. Like, say we won World War II. So we must have at some point had an exemplary military culture, right? So interesting, at the beginning of World War II, we were failing. And the leaders of the US said, this is bad. And they just revamped the top leadership structure of the military and said, like, old people out, new people, and you guys need to change stuff because we're failing. And that worked roughly after a year. They actually changed their attitude and changed leadership and changed how we do things. And then that helped us win the war. But that doesn't mean the next generation after that or after that actually has all the same attitudes and effectiveness. The reason why it had gone bad before was that you had a long period of peace where the previous winners were no longer the winners, right? So our whole society can go wrong in exactly that way. That's the key thing to realize. And that's happened over and over again in the past. Just because we once were great doesn't mean that ensures that we stay great, because cultures change over time. Old people get replaced, new people have different strategies, how they got there. And then we just have this whole world of cultural activism whereby people are trying to change culture. So that's, in some sense, the most amazing fact about the modern world. Look, the world keeps changing, and we would have to be changing some things to accommodate that. Like, there's no way we could just treat everything like we did in 1800 and that would work today, right? We have enough change in context. We had to change something to deal with a different world from 1800, right? And just through those changes, we could just make bad choices, and then culture could go wrong because we made bad choices about how to adapt to the various things that we had to adapt to because they were different. But in addition to a bunch of things forcing us to change, we eagerly tried to cause more changes. We have a whole history of elites being most motivated by being cultural activists who seek out problems and try to cause culture to change to fix those problems. And that goes back centuries, really. I'm reading about Middlemarch from the early 1800s in Britain, and the elites there are always talking about how they're going to go cause some cultural change that would reform and make things better. And that's just been a long-standing obsession of elites to be the source of cultural change that they see as good. But I think, in fact, the cultural changes that they've caused have not been particularly aligned with or correlated with adaptiveness, which means they're random, which means they're on average bad. So cultural activism is on average just making things go worse faster.
Listening to what you're talking about, using a corporation as a microcosm for larger society, but it seems like, years ago, at least in the US, you'd have kind of the elites were like engineers, or they were creators or producers, and now a lot of the quote unquote elites are like in finance, where you're not actually creating anything, you're just kind of like moving money around. It just seems like our elite culture has like changed from like creators and meritocracy to money movers.
Right. So this is a fine example, but let's think about it at the higher level. Over time, we see all these trends, lots of trends. That's one trend. And we have cultural elites in our world, and our most prestigious people in our culture are the people who comment on cultural trends and who try to tell about which direction they should go. So they might say, we need more engineers, we need fewer screens, we need longer school. Like, the world of cultural elites, keynote addressers, big sale bookers is full of people talking about recent cultural trends and which ones they like and don't, and which trends they want to push, right? And then there's another set of people in academia who specialize in studying how this whole system works, and they're not prestigious at all. And they're so scared of even commenting on this because they wouldn't be cited as scientific. They just want to stay out of that discussion. But we have a trend like, fewer engineers, and we have to wonder, well, is that an adaptive trend or not? Was that a reasonable response to some circumstances that we needed to respond to? Or was it just one of these trends that changed for no good reason, which made things worse? And the problem is it's hard for any one of them to tell that. But if you think about the overall process, you should ask, okay, well, what were the forces that would make these be good choices, right? And so say if we look about capitalism and companies competing, we can say, I don't know if any one company is doing the right choice, but I can see that the net effect of capitalist competition is going to make firms on average make better choices about whether they have too many engineers or not. And so I would trust their choices relative to their, at least capitalist incentives, to be making good responses there. So if I see a healthy system of cultural evolution, like competition among firms to serve customers, then I can more trust the changes there because they result from this healthy process, right? And then I look at larger scale social trends, like, going more to school or staying more on medicine or more culture, political polarization, or I look at all these other trends and I say, what's causing those? And how much can I trust that the causes of those trends are tracking some larger functionality and adaptiveness that makes them be good trends? And I honestly can't see very good causes there. That is, it seems like it's pretty random. Like, for example, the biggest cultural event of the 20th century was World War II, the Great Wars. And that was pretty random. It was pretty random that Hitler take control of Germany, that he started a war, and that he lost the war. But still, the biggest cultural event was that once Hitler lost the war, the rest of the world decided to double down on we're anti-Hitler as this one thing of culture they thought they knew. So they're going to be anti-racist. And then that said, well, let's be anti-sexist. And, and that's a big part of post-World War II cultural trends is just doubling down on what the thing we all agree on is we're anti-Nazi. But if that's just the result of this pretty random war being won or lost, it's hard to see that as, humanity learned a deep lesson that we've adapted to. It's like random changes. And unfortunately, a lot of the particular cultural trends I see are more random. Like, so let's take engineers, right? The main reason we have fewer engineers is because we have more designers. And the main reason for that is we have more product and service variety. If we had kept very low variety like we had at the early 20th century, We would have fewer products, but they would be better designed and get cheaper faster. And we would all be richer with bigger houses and bigger cars and lots of stuff, except there'd be less variety of them. And what we decided instead was we wanted more variety of everything. And because that, we needed fewer engineers, we needed more designers. And that's why we had that trend. But now you say, was it good to have more variety? Is that an adaptive, valuable thing of civilization? And it's not, because it's actually useful. It just looked like that was a status thing. People, so I don't know if you've ever heard the song Little Boxes. It's a 30s song roughly making fun of people who lived in suburbs, because they had all these little houses that look the same. They're going, ha ha ha, you aren't a very good person if you live in houses that look the same as other people. Good people have variety. Good people their houses look different, their clothes look different or something. And that's part of a cultural war that the variety of people won to crush the non-variety people and saying those are bad people and variety people are good people. And that's a cultural trend. But if I say, does that track something valuable in terms of what makes a civilization persist and grow and be more capable? I'm not seeing it really.
Talking about like the cultural war. I mean, you mentioned in some of the other podcasts about how, the Amish in probably 200 years would just kind of rule, like at least the US, because their population is doubling. But then I kind of look at now with like all like the trans rights, where it's like, okay, you're not going to have any kids. You're, people on the left, basically, it's like if you have a kid, you're killing the planet. So don't have kids. But then it just seems like at that point, you're going to have, I mean, there's a few pockets in the US where they have substantially above replacement rate. The Amish you mentioned, there's a Jewish population in New York, which is quite a bit higher. I think Mormons for years, even though I think now they're kind of plateauing out. And then there's like a Christian sect in like South Dakota that is also kind of significantly above. So does this, like, if these trends continue in 200 years, the US is going to be significantly different than it is now, right?
Right. So there's this thing that modern people tell themselves, which is that we are past natural selection. Natural selection no longer applies to us because we're not animals. We're beyond being animals. And it's certainly true that humans have invented culture, and that's a new kind of natural selection that makes our natural selection process go different than other animals. But it is just natural selection, and we are animals, and natural selection applies to us. So if you look at your population declining in times of plenty, that's just a pretty clear sign that something's going wrong with your species or your subpart of the species, because natural selection applies to you just as much as it applies to other animals in terms of that parameter is just as relevant and is just as bad a sign. So, but the people who decided that natural selection doesn't apply for them, that's no longer relevant. They look at declining population and go, yeah, who cares? But the other groups that are growing, in contrast, they're winning the natural selection game. And if they just keep winning, then they win overall. So yes, the most straightforward prediction, I think, is just that high fertility groups will displace low fertility groups. Now, the key thing to notice, though, is these high fertility groups aren't just high fertility. The other thing they are is insular. Insularity is key to their success. For example, if you just had say you had 12 kids and you taught them that having a lot of kids is great, and you sent them out in the world, they're just going to mix in the world. They're going to go to college and go work somewhere else and socialize and marry. And your distinctive cultural difference will just bleed out and be a drop of ink in the ocean, and it will just disappear. Well, what they have is a group of people who behave differently, who then stay together and resist outside cultural influence. And that's what allows them to persist over generations as a distinctive cultural group with distinct values and behaviors. And so they put a lot of work into that insularity. Like the Amish don't want cars because that you could move people either. They reject a lot of technology. They are pacifists because they don't want their young men mixing with other young men in war preparations. And they make a lot of sacrifices in order to maintain that insularity. Their religion is a big part of it. They need this rationale for the insularity, and the religion is a big part of the rationale for why they should be insular. And that's, unfortunately, most of these high fertility groups share a bunch of these features. They're insular, they're pacifist, they reject a lot of technology, they think badly of the outside world, and have religious reasons for thinking badly, and for just, and they're very decentralized. They're fragmented. They don't have a center typically who can give orders to everybody else. Each group of 100 people roughly governs themselves and makes their own choices. And that seems to be the winning formula for these groups to grow. So even if these particular groups we see will somehow fail, other groups will probably take up and succeed in. But then the basic result over centuries is they win. So that's the lifeboat versus turn the ship choice I think we face. You have to either get a large chunk of our shared world culture to change its attitudes, or you have to break off and separate yourself and insulate yourself to create a separate culture.
Professor Hanson, since you are an economist at George Mason University, I'm just curious what a negative growth model of GDP would look like. I mean, basically since human history, we've had this positive growth model. And then once we hit like a really big...
We did see declining populations in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and we saw economic responses to that. Like, one thing is that, look, say a population falls by half. You could just have each town fall by half, or you could abandon half the towns and have the other towns be just as full. And that second thing is what people do. So they don't want to have half a town and then pay twice as much per person for all the infrastructure costs. They just abandon small places and crowd into the remaining bigger places. And that's a thing that we can predict is a thing that happens as an economy declines. Then we can also predict scale economies go down. Like we were talking about, the number of flights out of a city will go down because you don't have as many people there and they're not doing as many flights. But even the software, like a lot of software is basically a fixed cost for writing the software, and then you have so many customers who pay for it. The fewer customers you have, the fewer kinds of software you can support. So the world of declining population is a world where a lot of software systems just get dropped and fail to be maintained because there's not enough customers to support that. So the world of software shrinks in terms of the range of tools that you have available. And if you've relied on too many tools, your system will just collapse and be lost as a system because people can't be supporting it. So the software systems that will win will be the tight, small ones that have relatively few tools they're based on that then they can, maintain cheaply because their number of customers will go down. Also, up till now, we mostly make hardware that doesn't last very long in computers and electronics, but we could. That is, electronics can in principle be very durable hardware, but because they've been improving so fast, we don't bother to make them durable. We make them to be replaced in 3 years or something because we expect in 3 years they'll just be a lot cheaper. But in a declining economy, we'll no longer have new generations of computers every few years. And that will mean we'll switch to a moment where it'll make a lot more sense to make very durable computer hardware and electronics. And once we make some durable ones for a generation, then we won't need to make more the next generation. We'll just shut the whole thing down. As we switch from making, short duration generations that are expected to be replaced soon by much better ones, to making a generation that we don't expect to be better, and then we make it durable. And then once there's a whole world full of durable hardware, there's not much point in making much more. And we would just lose the whole computer industry in terms of making computers. And then for maybe a century or two, we would just not make computer hardware at all and use the old stuff we have. And slowly, as the world declines, the things that breaks, we throw them away, but we still have plenty of old stuff that we can still use. And then if you try to start that up again later, it'll be really hard. There's just a lot of knowledge about how to make the whole computer industry that would just be lost at that point. And then it would be a lot of work to try to rediscover how to do all that. So that's the kind of thing we could lose in a declining world economy. We can just lose the ability to make complicated computer hardware.
So we go from planned obsolescence to unplanned obsolescence is what it sounds like.
Right. We make a generation of durable stuff. I mean, it would all claim to be durable, but some of it would turn out not actually to be durable. And we find out later which one was durable. And that's the stuff that would get used, but then no new stuff would be made for a while.
We're in 2025 now. I mean, everyone hears about ChatGPT and all these other AI tools. I mean, we've heard about, China's DeepSeek, and the article I was mentioning to you, talking about this whole innovation. Their basically thesis was maybe that innovation could be enhanced with using these AI tools. How does AI play into this? Can this, as we have less people, can AI augment
right.
Is
So
that
if we could achieve human level AI in the sense of AI that can replace humans on job tasks wholesale, then human population decline is no longer such an issue because we can just replace it with AI population increase. So that's a scenario where the economy then could grow. It's not so much because of the particular roles that AI is taking, it's just the idea that it could take on a great many roles. So if AI is only capable of taking a small range of roles, that's what we've seen for the last 2 centuries. Automation slowly takes over certain roles, but leaves most of the rest for humans. If we continue to see that, we're still going to have the decline. But if we found a kind of AI that could wholesale do most of the jobs that humans could do, now that's a game changer. And that would mean this decline doesn't happen. There's a deadline here, though, on this. In order to get AI being better, you have to have innovation. But if innovation stops, then we stop getting better AI, right? So I've calculated maybe there's another 70 years worth of innovation at past rates before we reach this deadline. So the question is, in that time, can we achieve human level AI? And I think it's iffy. I don't think we're at human level AI or close right now. Recent developments are great, and that we're going to try them out and see how far they can go. But that's what we've been doing for a long time, producing new innovative approaches and trying them out, see how far they can go. And in the past, we have found applications for them. But again, we've found limited applications that displace a limited range of jobs, not wholesale all of the economy. So I did a study on automation in the US a few years ago, looked at all the jobs in the US from 1999 to 2019, a 20-year period. And I had for each job how automated it is. So I could show that on average, automation had increased over that period. And when automation changed in a job to get more or less, that did not correlate at all with changes in wages or the number of people who had jobs in that area. And I also found that the predictors that said which jobs are easier to automate, those predictors did not change over that 20-year period. There was no change in the nature of automation over that 20-year period. And I would bet that's still true if we did the next 5 years of data. So even though there's a lot of hype about new technologies and AI, et cetera, the actual practice of automating jobs has not been changing, and it's pretty low tech. The biggest predictor of which jobs get automated, which tasks get automated, are other jobs nearby being automated. Automation is something that spreads through the network of job tasks in the world, because when a job is more automated, you have better measures of output, you have better controlling of the input, you have more controlled environments in which they happen, you have synchronization and rates that you can predict better. All the things that make automation easier happen more when a job nearby that task is also automated. So that's the better way, I think, to think of automation. It's just something that spreads slowly through the task, the set of all job tasks. New AI technology so far just hasn't done much to that process. And the question is whether it will do much in the near future. But again, even if it doesn't do much in the next 10 years, it still could do something in the next 50. And so that's an open question. If we can get human level AI, then yes, we no longer need as many humans. The robots can take their place, but that's a big if. So we should wonder, we should have a fallback plan. What if we can't do that?
so? The fallback plan is let's increase the fertility rate. So, what is the solutions to actually turning this fertility ship around?
Okay, so there's this financial solution, which I outlined a bit before, that is, children are actually an economic win-win deal. The problem is we're treating it as a gift now. And if people aren't willing to do it as a gift, we need to make it more of an explicit deal. So now the free market solution would be letting parents endow their kids with debt, where we say, you're going to have to pay back this debt when you're older, and that will pay off, the debts that I incurred to raise you. And that's now becomes a win-win deal. But people hate this idea. People hate the idea of endowing kids with debt at the individual level, but they don't mind it at the government level. That is, in fact, every new kid is now endowed with their share of their national debt. So in the US, the official debt endowed per person is roughly $100,000, but the unfunded liabilities per person that each new kid is endowed with is $300,000 to $700,000. So it would be worth paying parents a cut of that, because that's how much the government will benefit from each new kid. So I think if you could give on average each parent $300,000 per kid, that would definitely move the needle in terms of activities for having kids. That amount of money would definitely move people. And again, people hate that at the individual level, but they don't mind it at the collective government level. So the straightforward way to do that is just to give each parent a percentage of their kids' tax payments that they'll pay in the future, make that a transferable asset they can sell now in order to pay for parenting expenses. So that's a way to make fertility a win-win deal financially. Unfortunately, I still think people don't like it because they realize that if this works, it'll work by changing cultural trends. So I said there are these key cultural trends that are causing fertility to decline. And if offering $300,000 per parent per kid is going to induce that, it's going to induce that by towns and companies and groups of people saying, how can we get that money? How can we reorganize our lives to get a cut of that? They would be thinking about how to change schooling, how to change careers, how to change family arrangements. They'd be reorganizing their lives somehow in order to make it possible to grab this money. And they would then somehow reverse a lot of these trends. There'd be less education, less gender equality, more cornerstone marriages, less attention per child. I don't know what combination they would actually pick that works, but they would be motivated to search in the space of possibilities to find something that works. But whatever works, no doubt, is going to be reversing some of these trends. And people love these trends. And they, I think, are willing to fight to prevent the trends from being reversed, even to prevent win-win deals that could create more kids via reversing these trends.
Do you think we're right now going to see some of these trends happen naturally? I mean, you see now that a lot of the young men that are in high school aren't going to college; they're going more to the trade school. So if instead of taking on all this college debt, you actually, say you're a plumber or an electrician or some job that can't be automated away anyways, and then you graduate in a year, you're making money, so now all of a sudden women are more attracted to you because you're a young man that's in shape with cash instead of in college and debt. At least now it seems like the trend, at least of the younger generation, is maybe, at least among the men, is we'll do less university, and that seems to be a big part of this having less children. If you're in college for 8 years, you're not having kids.
Education is still a very strong status marker in our world. And women are very eager to marry high status men, especially if they think they have status. So college educated women are quite reluctant to marry non-college educated men, even if they make more money, because they feel that they have a right to somebody who has their same status markers. But more generally, just the larger problem here is that culture has been randomly walking in the space of possible cultures, drifting away from what was once functionality. Randomness could, in principle, happen to drift back in a good direction, but in a high dimensional space, that's pretty unlikely. It happens to go, right back to the good places. So there's lots of cultural trends happening that are unpredictable, and some of them might well move in a good direction, but it's just unlikely that overall the trends will move in a good direction, because what's been happening for a century or longer is just this random walk in the space of possible cultures, moving away from what was once an adaptive behavior to these less adaptive regions. So we'd need a pressure that was aligned with adaptiveness to expect that these changes will be more adaptive. So like you say, well, won't men want to attract women? Well, they want to attract women according to the status markers women have, but those don't necessarily align with fertility. There's no particular reason that whatever men will do to be more attracted to women will in fact make the two of them more fertile.
I see what you're saying, but I also look at the top 10% of women are very attracted to that. But I mean, I'm from a small town in Wisconsin, and there are many famous cheese making factories, and they make, really good money. And one of my buddies has worked at one since the 90s, and he was making six figures in the early 2000s. And if he wore his work shirt that said the company name on it, and we were out at a bar, we were just out walking in the mall, he would literally have women come up to him that were significantly younger, very attractive, and be like, oh, like you work at that cheese factory, and he'd be like, oh yeah. And they were just basically throwing themselves at him. And it's like, yeah, the women that were the lawyers or the attorneys or the medical doctors, of course, were not, but that's not the majority of women, right? That's not the vast majority. The vast majority of women are not making 200,000 as some corporate attorney. So I don't know. It just seems like, yeah, maybe the top women are always still going to go for the billionaires or whatever. But it just a lot more women will be interested in men if they're making six figures working at a cheese factory or as a plumber, or, like I think ultimately women want comfort. I mean, the whole women are gold diggers. Well, gold digger is a euphemism for comfort.
In the last 20 years in the US, the biggest fertility decline has been among lower class women. So those college educated women, their fertility is mainly, do they marry? And if they marry, when, basically, because if they wait too long, then they can't have very many kids. But predictably, if they marry, they try to have kids with whatever time is left. But the big decline has been in less marriage, and that's most happen at the lower class levels. So it's the lower class women and men who are marrying less, who are then having fewer kids over the last 20 years in the US. I mean, there's lots of details, but again, I want you to keep in mind these two levels of analysis. One, we can walk through each particular trend and ask what's causing it and how we might change it and like what particular effects it has. But there's this larger level of analysis of how does this whole system work? How does culture change? What's causing all these cultural changes? And that level, I want you to just understand there's a very basic cultural evolution process that's pretty random. And so in the past, culture was kept healthy because of a lot of variety and strong selection pressures. 3 centuries ago, if some local peasant culture went bad, picked a bad marriage norm or something, it just lost out to its neighbors and got squashed and was replaced. That's how cultural evolution worked for 1,000,000 years. And then in the last century, we've squashed all that variation to share a global culture. And we've squashed the selection pressures in that almost no cultures die now for starvation or war or things like that. And in addition, the environment's changing fast, and we are trying to cause fast change through cultural, activism. And those set of parameter changes just are a recipe for our shared world culture to drift into dysfunction. And that doesn't depend on the particulars so much. That's just a fact of the whole structure. And if you see that whole structure, you realize we have a deep structural problem, regardless of our attitudes toward work and cheese factories or, things of these various details. I mean, we have a deep, longer term problem.
What's the timeline when we're really going to feel this population decline at a really kind of local level where everyone's going to be like, man, like, well, there's just, I can't get, this, brand of cheese I wanted because there's not enough people buying it.
Right. Like Japan is already there, but they're not really noticing it that much. I mean, because each person's living their lives, et cetera. And it's not a world changing thing. It's just a lot of minor inconveniences accumulate. So, the biggest headline news was when world population peaks and starts to decline, and that'll happen in about three decades. But even then, the decline in innovation rates will be slow and gradual. And by then, people will be kind of used to have adapted to this new declining world. We'll have ways of giving retirement benefits to old people and, managing declining innovation rates, managing declining, airline trips, et cetera. So I fear that there just won't be an emergency moment. That is, there's a moment now where we're just seeing this long-term problem, which isn't in our face, and the problem will slowly get in our face. There won't be any particular crisis. And that's the problem.
Today's guest is Robin Hanson. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University. You've written a couple books. Just where can people get a hold of your articles, get a hold of your books, that kind of information? And then secondly, Robin, leave us with a final thought related to this podcast or something maybe we didn't talk about that we should have, etc.
So I am Robin Hanson. You can Google my name and find lots of stuff about me. My website is hanson.gmu.edu. I guess the highest level thing I want to point out is just that there's a world of appetite for identifying the world's problems and pontificating on them. But people usually like to be sophisticated about it. They want to report, technical knowledge about global warming or knowledge about military preparations or knowledge about, economic issues or government structures. People love to show off their sophisticated knowledge of all these topics in pontificating about the world's problems and how to fix them. And unfortunately, this problem is pretty low tech and at a very basic values culture level you don't sound very sophisticated talking about it. And I fear that's the biggest problem here is this problem just isn't a winner for showing off your knowledge of the world and your great insight or even your great moral values in pontificating about it. It's just a messy problem that's low tech and will still take us down if we don't fix it. But you're not going to win a lot of accolades in your discussion of it, unfortunately.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.